Good day to you. Can you believe some of the changes that have taken place even in your lifetime and across most of our lifetimes in terms of societal beliefs? What I'm talking about, for example, is gay marriage. Gay marriage was illegal when I was born, and it became legal after a long period where people were resistant to it. And then there's the marijuana legalization reform effort that took place across many states in the US, including Pennsylvania. Pot, marijuana, weed was totally illegal when I was young. Now it's legal. It's legal as a medicinal use. It's legal for medicinal purposes, and it's also legal in many states recreationally. And then there's the Me Too movement. The idea that women are no longer going to take sexual harassment anymore, and they're going to use a hashtag on social media to make their cause known. And then there's the Black Lives Matter movement, a movement that's trying to restore justice amongst all races, and particularly for African Americans. All of these changes took place because of media, because of conversations in the media, because the pendulum swung towards the efforts of these movements due to media. And so that's what we're taking on today. We're taking on this next chapter, chapter number 2. It's all about mass communication effects of mass media, effects of mass media on society, the way that we think, the way that we believe, the way that we behave. And what is mass society? This is a class called Mass Communication, Introduction to Mass Media. We're talking about mass communication. What is a mass society? That's a society that took place after industrialization. So we're going to set up now a theme which will become present through some of the other lectures in this course, talking about the role of industrialization in the rise of mass communication. So what is industrialization? Well, you can take a look at one of the links that I've included in today's email to you, and you'll see rural America. You'll see a family sitting in front of a house, looking like they are existing in primitive time periods. There's no electricity, there's no automobile, they're just sitting in front of their house. And this is the way that people lived prior to industrialization. They lived in rural communities. Everybody knew their neighbor. You were destined to work in an occupation that your father decided you were going to work in. He's a barrel maker, you're going to be a barrel maker. Your mother's a homemaker, you're going to be a homemaker. You know everybody in rural America because you live and work alongside them every single day. Industrialization changes all of that. Industrialization is the building of factories in big cities to produce mass goods. That's what industrialization is all about. And if you go to Philadelphia, if you go to New York, you go to Baltimore, you will still see parts of the city that were affected by industrialization. The factories, the smokestacks, the small tenement houses. People flocked to the cities to work in jobs in factories, and that created mass society because these people started to have an income where they could have extra money to spend on products other than just clothes and necessities because they're earning more income working in the factories. And this starts to produce a culture of people who want to consume mass media. And so we're going to set that up today. We're going to set that up and we're going to continue on with how industrialization affected really our lives, but in particular mass media. All right, so the first way that we want to study the effects of mass media is to look at models. Like we did last class, we looked at models of communication. Now we're going to look at models of effects. And the first model is called the propaganda or direct effects model. You can see a link for it in my email. The propaganda or direct effects model is where the media have a direct effect on the people who are consuming the media. This model grew out of World War II, where there was a way of thinking during that time period in our lives, the 1950s, that media were taking advantage of passive audiences. The audiences were not thinking beings, that they could be completely affected by whatever they would see on television or listen to on radio or read in a newspaper. A good example of that is also a link that I provided for you on the Reefer Madness propaganda film that was made in support of the U.S. government. Reefer Madness, portraying people who are smoking pot as being deranged, being murderous, being hysterical, being out of control. That's what the direct effects model said would take place if you show people this reefer madness film. It's going to cause them not to use marijuana. That's the direct effects model. All right, so that model then gave way to the next model. The next model is called the limited effects model. The limited effects model was developed by a researcher named Paul Lazarsfeld. Paul Lazarsfeld, he was interested in studying voter behaviors, and so he did some studies in Ohio in elections, and he found that there is support for a limited effects model. And that's with the idea that people are not affected directly by mass media, but what happens is mass media affect opinion leaders, also known as gatekeepers, and then those opinion leaders are who influence people who watch the media. Those opinion leaders are our teachers, our preachers, our school officials, our parents, politicians, experts, athletes. These are people that fit in the limited effects model. They're the opinion leaders. Mass media affects opinion leaders, and then we listen to opinion leaders. The next model is known as the critical cultural model. The critical cultural model, and this model focuses on the generation of meaning by a media message, how meaning is arrived at by people who are watching media, how meaning is arrived at, how meaning is constructed. For example, if you were to watch Cops is a show that was taken off of the air, finally, in my view, because of the Black Lives Movement. Because why? Because it was always portraying black people as the ones getting arrested, always portraying black people as the ones who are committing crimes. And so a critical cultural model might say, the meaning that people get from these shows is that black people are more likely to make crimes than white people. And that's not a meaning that we want to have going on in a society that's trying to achieve racial justice. And so that's why Cops was taken off the air, because finally that meaning became known, became more broadly discussed than just implied. All right, now that we're done with those three models, we're going to move on to another area of study that has to do with mass communication effects, and this is called message effects. Message effects. So it's the idea that a message that's a mass media message is going to have effects on certain dimensions of the way that we conduct ourselves. So here are the dimensions. So the first dimension is cognitive effects. This is the idea that messages affect our thinking. It's the way that we learn. We learn about other countries across the world. We learn about sports teams that have played games. We learn about weather. This is the cognitive processing that we do of media. It's a thinking. It's learning in many ways. It's using media to affect our thinking. And that's different from a second kind of effect, and the second kind of effect is called attitudinal effect. Attitudinal effects, if you prefer. And this is where people develop a feeling. They develop a feeling based on media. So, for example, the show Shameless is a pretty popular show on Netflix, and it was also on one of the cable channels before it hit Netflix. And it takes place in Chicago, and it's following a very dysfunctional family. The father is an alcoholic, drug addict, and con artist. And then the rest of the family is in similar kinds of destructive situations. And when you watch that show, one of the attitudes that you can kind of develop when you watch Shameless is an irreverence for authority. Because all of the characters in the show, they have irreverence. That's disrespect. And so if you feel that when you're watching the show, it's an attitudinal effect. It's being inspired to have feelings of irreverence just by watching a TV show. The next kind of effect is what's known as behavioral effects. Behavioral effects is where you take on new behaviors. The whole idea of jogger pants, made popular by rap artists. I mean, who would be wearing jogger pants if not for people listening to music and watching music videos, seeing jogger pants? It's an example of how our behavior is altered, and really much of our clothing choices are influenced by media, by what other people are wearing, by what is being sold, and we can tell what's being sold by advertisements. And so this is our behavior in action. And then finally we have psychological effects, which I don't really care for as a title. I think the book got this one wrong. Psychological effects, I think it should be called physiological effects. Physiological effects, this last area, this is where your body is physically altered by the media that you're watching. As in, when your heart starts to beat faster because you know that this crime drama that you're watching is portraying a person who's about to do somebody else harm, and that somebody else is not aware of this person who's going to cause them harm, but you are, because you see both of them and your heart starts racing. Or sexual responses, when you see a character who you're attracted to and you get those feelings of, I have feelings inside of me. I can feel that my body's changing. I'm getting a little bit sweaty, or I feel aroused. Adrenaline plays a big role in physiological responses. That's the injection of adrenaline in your body that makes your heart race and makes you have anxiety in some cases. These are examples of physiological effects that we feel when we are accessing media. Now we're going to move on from message effects. We're going to take on medium effects. Medium effects, the effect of the medium, a medium of a television, a medium of a radio, a medium of a computer, a medium of a newspaper. The medium is the vehicle that carries the message. And Marshall McLuhan is one of the main researchers who wrote on medium effects. Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian professor, and he actually said that the medium is the message. I mean, you may know about that saying, right? The medium is the message. It's basically saying that a person being on a phone, the reason that that's so important is not actually what they're texting to somebody else, or what's important is not that they're hearing a person's voice if they're on a phone call. What's important is just being on the phone. Being on the phone is what it's all about. Being on the phone before you go to bed. Being on the phone when you get up in the morning. You know what it's like when you don't have your phone, right? You feel naked. Where's my phone? Oh no. Where did I leave it? I can't think about anything else. Being on the phone is an example of the medium is the message. And so medium effects look at the effect of a medium. And it's no secret that if you have a television in your family room, then you probably have a coffee table, because the coffee table goes with the TV, because you sit on the couch to watch TV, and a lot of times it's when you're hungry, and so we have a coffee table to put things down on. And then the couch also invites you to lay down rather than sit up when you're watching television. So then you start laying down and you're eating and you're not exercising. These are examples of the effect of the medium, not the message, but the medium. And then next up we have what's known as ownership effects. Ownership effects are the effects that result from big companies owning the media. We're going to talk about this in more detail next class. But ownership effects look at really big media companies like Disney, which owns ABC, and ESPN. Did you know that? That Disney owns that, and it's a part owner of Hulu. Did you know that? There are other big companies too. There's NBC Universal. There's the News Corporation, which owns Fox. There's Viacom. There's Bertelsmann. We're going to talk about these companies next time. It's the idea that when you have really big companies owning media, there are going to be effects on those media. We're going to talk about those effects in next class, but I'll just summarize them right now by saying that in many cases, a company is risk aversive. Risk aversive, they don't want to try new programs. They want to go with what a hit is. And so that's why you have The Voice and American Idol and other shows that mimic that same format, that break out, but they don't radically change the idea of having a song contest. They just do a small variation on it. And those are effects of ownership, of big ownership, companies that are risk aversive. Now we're going to move to theories of media and society. What the theories of media and society are when it comes to mass communication performing certain functions for us. And in fact, that's the first area that we're going to look at. It's called a functional analysis. A functional analysis says that media perform a job for us. That's what the effect is. They're performing a job for us. And one of the functions that media perform for us is surveillance. Surveillance, it's like having a security camera using your television, using your phone, using your radio. It's the idea that you can survey your environment, right? You can't see Germany right now, but you can if you go on television and you look for a show that was shot in Germany. It's like extending your eyes, media surveillance is. The next area that media function in is correlation. Correlation, and this is to impose a structure on our events, giving those events an order of importance. That's what correlation is imposing a structure on events. So when you watch a newscast, the very first story is a hard news story. It is not a sports story. It's not a weather story. It's not there's been a new park that's been built in the neighborhood story. It's a crime story usually, or a scandal story, or an injury story, or a sex scandal story. This is the first story. So media are imposing on us a belief system that says the most important news is scandal, is crime. The less important news is sports, weather, and so on. That's what correlation is all about. And then another function that media provide for us is the transmission of culture. The transmission of culture from one generation to the next. I mean, how do you know how to celebrate New Year's Eve? It's coming up. How do you know about that? How do you know that you should be wearing a cone hat? How do you know that you should be counting down when it gets to 10 seconds before midnight? How do you know that you should be eating hors d'oeuvres? How do you know that you should have a glass of champagne? How do you know that you should kiss everybody in the room? These are all behaviors that are taught to us by seeing New Year's Eve celebrated on media, by seeing YouTube videos, by seeing television programs covering Times Square, etc. So this is media transmitting culture, how to behave, rituals, how to celebrate, transmitting culture from one generation to the next. And then there is entertainment. This is using media to escape, to get away, to just say, you know what, I'm going to forget this pandemic world that I'm in. I'm going to jump into this Netflix show and nothing else is going to exist around me because I'm just going to be entertained. So that's the functional analysis of theories of media and society. Now let's go into the next analysis, which is agenda setting. The agenda setting theory is the idea that media don't tell us what to think, they tell us what to think about. So if you watch CNN, for example, you will see an agenda. Media telling us what to think about. If you watch CNN, they're talking all day long about the pandemic and the problems that our country has had in responding to it. So if you were to be asked, what's the most important issue facing Americans right now? If you're a CNN watcher, you might answer the pandemic. CNN is setting the agenda for what we think about. CNN is telling us not what to think, but what to think about. Next up is the theory called uses and gratifications. Uses and gratifications says, you know what, the audience is not passive like the direct effects model thinks it is. The audience is not stupid. The audience is not vulnerable. The audience is actually quite smart. The audience is in charge of their media use. In fact, they use media to be gratified by it. That's what the audience does. They use media to be gratified by it. You listen to a song to get into a good mood, or you listen to a song to get slowed down so you can get ready for bed, or you listen to a song so that you can reflect on your relationship. This is you as an audience member saying, I'm in charge, I'm going to select my media, and I'm going to use it to achieve very specific gratifications. Next up is the theory of social learning. Social learning theory. It's the idea that we learn by observing what others do. We learn by observing what others do on media. So how do you know that you're supposed to be liking others' pages on Facebook? How do you know that you're supposed to be sharing? How do you know that you're supposed to type LOL? How do you know that you're supposed to do that? It's kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with other effectiveness classes, but in this case, it's specifically addressing the idea that media teach us how to behave by watching how others behave on media. Next up is the theory of symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism, this is where we interact with each other using signs and symbols, which are words and phrases and hand signals. We interact with each other, and when we interact with each other, what we're doing is we are creating common meanings. And when we interact through media, we are creating common meanings through media. You have a favorite television show, you have a favorite book, you have a favorite band, and you know that there's somebody out there who you can speak with who gets a similar kind of meaning. I mean, I'm a big Rolling Stones fan, and when I see Keith Richards, if you know who he is, he's the guitarist. Other people who are also Rolling Stones fans who are Keith Richards fans, as opposed to Mick Mick Jagger fans, which is the other main band member, those people who are Keith Richards fans, they have a similar way of liking the Stones. They like his personality, they like his outlaw image, they like his guitar playing. It's not about the singing, it's about the guitar playing. It's an idea of symbolic interactionism. People who listen to the Rolling Stones, who are into Keith Richards, are going to have similar meanings. Next up is the theory of the spiral of silence. The theory of the spiral of silence. And that is the idea that there can be a majority of people out there who are unwilling to make themselves known. So they're a majority and they have an opinion, but you don't find out about it because they keep it quiet. They are people, this is what was said was the case for the election of Donald Trump in 2016. All of the polls that I read said that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency, with the exception of one poll, the LA Times. Every single poll had Hillary Clinton winning the election. Well, guess what? She didn't. Donald Trump won the election because there was a majority of people in 2016 who did not express their opinions to pollsters, but they had opinions and they exercised those opinions at the ballot box. That's the spiral of silence. And then finally, we have the theory of cultivation analysis. Cultivation analysis, it's invented by the researcher I mentioned last class, the professor at the University of Pennsylvania named George Gerbner. And George Gerbner said that media cultivate in us a view that society is actually more dangerous than it really is. Yeah, that's what Gerbner is saying, that media cultivate in us a view that society is more dangerous than it really is. So if you watch a lot of TV news in Philadelphia, for example, you'll see a lot of crime stories, and you'll see a lot of gun stories, and you'll see a lot of drug stories, and you'll see a lot of violent stories, and a lot of fire stories. And so this world that surrounds you starts to be perceived as being just like the news that you're watching, to the extent that a car pulls up on the sidewalk and wants to ask you directions, and you're scared, right? You're scared and you're backing away because you perceive that that person is a threat to you. This is how George Gerbner's cultivation analysis plays out, that media make us think that the world is scarier and more dangerous than it really is. If you look at real statistics, crime might have dropped in your area, or it's not as dense with crime activity as the TV shows depicting. That's what George Gerbner is saying is happening when we watch a lot of crime news, that it cultivates us the feeling that our world is much more dangerous than it really is. That then will wrap up our second chapter on media effects. Have a great day.